Dr. Power.
Good.
Your guests have arrived.
Thank you, Chelsea. It's very kind of you. Come on in, folks. Katie is seated here. Kathy. Blair, why don't you sit right there? Good. I'm glad you joined us today as we go through this. Welcome to the second session. I hope you're having fun. Certainly, it's interesting to me that the pace, the tempo is picking up on the discussion site. And don't be overwhelmed. I just once again reinforce the need for 2 meaningful posts, all I expect from you to get embarked in this course. There'll be others that do far more because you're interested in a passion for the topic. I've had in the past some students who do as many 30 posts just because they enjoy the topic and want to have a bit of a dialogue back and forth. Use it, enjoy it, have fun with it. It's fine with me. But just for those that want to get through the course, 2 meaningful posts will get you what you need to do to meet my requirements to give you a passing grade in this particular course. This week we go on to the toolbox, the little red toolbox. You have about 40 tools in there. I don't expect you to know them all in this particular course, but have a look, play with them, get a sense of what they look like, become familiar with the component parts of it. But the important ones I'm going to say to you would be, and to most consultants starting out, would be the SWOT analysis. Most of you know that right now by the back of hand, but many haven't seen the TOES analysis that takes the data from the SWOT and migrates it over into a little matrix, and it's that data that from critical thinking comes out of those 4 little quads that leads us to action plans and strategies that we can take from the data that we've gleaned. And having said that, keep in mind that models don't make the decision for you, they simply inform your decision, but at the end of the day you make a decision to accept or reject the findings of the model. But they are good to take you by the hand and make sure you don't miss any steps along the way. So SWOT, TOES, I think the simple multi-attribute rating technique, the SMART model, is a very important one. Whenever you have to make a decision between options, a decision criteria matrix between options, the idea of market entry strategy, which country to select, which photocopy to select, which colleague to hire against key success factors and attributes that are important to you in making that decision down the left-hand side and weighted, and then do the extensions, helps you get there. There's a YouTube clip on this, but it's also in the little black book. But I consider that an important tool that you should be quite familiar with before we get finished this course. The strategic group map arises out of the SMART model, which is important, little balloons and weights and strengths against certain axes, and we'll talk about those. They're in the tools. And then finally, maybe the Porter's 5 forces, know that one. In fact, that's almost a rite of passage for MBAs and dealing with other MBAs, is that you're familiar with Porter's 5 forces and know it like the back of your hand. The rest of them, Boston Matrix for portfolio analysis, etc., use them, play with them, test drive them as you see fit. You have chances to do that in this course. I provided 2 context cases. Robinhood Goes Global in the next session, and a session or so after that we do, Robinhood, and the one after that we do Royal Rose Goes Global. Just little context cases. I don't mark them. I probably don't see a lot of your results, but I want you to work with your teams, practice some tools, have conversations. In the Robinhood case about the need for strategy and strategic inflection points and things of that nature that we'll be talking about as we go through the sessions. And then Royal Rose Go Global, some of the considerations entrepreneurs have to consider when taking their business from a home country to a host country. What are some of the things that go around in the decision-making process? Very at a superficial level, not marked, not graded, simply for you to practice. And at the end of each session, for those, I'll give you my thoughts to have a look at to see how well you compared with yours and mine. No wrong or right answers. I may have missed things. You may come up with different tools I didn't use. So we'll do that. But where it's important to you is by practicing on those 2 practice cases is that you'll be doing, on the final exam, a large case. And in there you have a chance to practice and demonstrate that you can do all these things. Let's deal now, if we can, with the deliverables. I'd like to just touch upon those if I can. Assignment number 1, I've asked you to go out there and find, in a particular industry, if you have one that I didn't list, it's important to you. I don't mind doing another one, but I've given you some suggested industries and sectors you can look at, whether it be hospital or retail or whatever. Go in there and find a particular article on the internet of everything, something that's current, cutting edge, something that leads to some so what's, what implications that might have for society and for politics and for the economy, something in there that arises out of it. So it's not enough just to cut and paste a story from the front page of the paper or the business section on the Internet of Everything, some new breakthrough. But I want to hear now the critical thinking. So that's your first slide out of 10 slides. The other 9 slides should take me down in a 10-minute PowerPoint presentation in class model as to what arises from that story. Tell me a bit about the actual story so we fully understand it, all of our colleagues understand it. But then take me down the road and explain to me what are some of the so whats that will flow out of that? What changes will people be laid off? Will retail states be laid down? Will it reduce the cost of hospital care in Canada? Take me through that and show me. In this particular assignment, we certainly don't want to discard the importance of APA methods and things like that. But at this point, I simply want the substance. I'm not overly concerned with the form. And so as long as I have 10 PowerPoints with the URL put in the slide somewhere so I know where it comes from and I can check out and read it myself, that will be sufficient, along with a one-page, probably in a bullet point or narrative, those little speaking notes that you'd have. If I said do a 10 PowerPoint, you'd have little speaking notes in front of you and you'd just be referring to slide 1, slide 2, explaining to me a little bit more detail on what maybe is contained on the slide. That's all. It's only 5 marks. No need to get carried away with it. It's a very simple little exercise. The second assignment should build on that the topic you built, I would hope that you would have the foresight to take a topic that you can use that research into your second assignment, where we start looking now into a 2,000-word paper that will pay attention to the APA with cover pages and tables of contents and executive summaries and references, appendixes. Appendixes don't count, by the way, towards the 2,000 words, where you will now have a good discussion in 2 parts. One is to talk about this particular Internet of Everything in your particular sector. You talk about maybe some examples, 5 or 6 sort of innovative things that are happening. And then in the second part of your paper, I want you to turn your mind to the dark side of what this Internet of Everything is going to do. The idea of data security and data privacy and data sovereignty and data censorship. I mean, today, just think what's happening with Google and Facebook and Twitter. They're censoring as we speak. They're taking the preferred, in their opinion, stories and putting them on the front and hiding down below stories that disagree with their view of the world and how it should be. In some cases, in Twitter, they just simply take it right off and don't allow you to post. And that seems to fly in the face of just fair play, that everybody's got a right to be heard. And you may not agree with some people's statements, but certainly we have a right to say those statements, it seems to me. And then we have a right to turn it off or not to listen. But increasingly, I'm becoming more and more concerned, as many are in the world and governments are in the world, with the increasing power these monopolies, this oligarchy of public thought have over your decisions, my decisions, and the decision makers of countries, and to what extent should they be controlled. And it's not unusual. I mean, America broke up Standard Oil when it got too big. Ma Bell got broken up by the Americans when it got too big. So when these things get too large, it's just good for competition. To stimulate more competition is to balkanize them and break them up into smaller sizes, where you may have an idea for a Twitter account, and rather than be edged out, give you a chance to fight and build up for competition and bring the price down. So it's a concern. But anyway, that's the second assignment. I'm looking for some discussion around that as a formal paper as you go through it. What else is on my mind? Yeah, this week we covered the strategist perspective, just to get your mind set on dealing with strategy, to break down some of the old mental models, identify some of the new mental models as we push forward. There are many, but these are just some to start you thinking that way. Hope you found some interesting challenges in there to start thinking a little bit differently. I posted, in fact, today's Wednesday, I'm going to post it tonight when I go home or first thing tomorrow morning, the one on the stormtroopers. And if you followed the instructions carefully and sort of put blinders on and focused your attention on the video itself and counted the stormtroopers and aimed for 19 or 20 or 21, I hope many of you did. But the point I'm trying to make is it was a shock and awe moment when you stood back for a few seconds and saw, when you played it the second time, the stormtrooper walked right across the screen and looked at us. And the point I'm trying to make with that is, all too often, unless you go into your offices and close the door for 20 minutes, where you just kick back and do what we're doing today, just sit and look at the paper and draw some so whats out of it, you'll never transform yourself from the administrator, the manager, into the leader of your organization without that move from data, information, knowledge into wisdom that I talk about in the first slide. And so we have to be careful in life that we're constantly on the lookout for these stormtroopers that are all around of us. Don't get so focused on the screen counting at the 19 widgets there, but zoom back out for a few minutes and ask why. That fourth man on the guns for the artillery, why? We need to do more of that. So that was the purpose of the first little session we had. In the second session, play with some tools. And by the way, there's about another 100 tools in the bonus section for those really interested. Again, with some explanation about them. Unlikely to ever use them in your lifetime, but if you're getting into consulting, you might just wish to go to find some more tools. They're there for you. What else is on my mind? Yeah, I want to talk, if I can, then briefly about the key thought arose out of this week's discussion sites, and that was that this transition in how we manage and what we expect the competencies to be of our workforce. And certainly in the industrial age, at the turn of the 19th century up to about 1970, most of what we did was teaching folks how to replicate, produce, bring costs down. That was the way we treated our folks from a management perspective. In fact, personnel managers were the big thing then, not human resource directors, vice presidents, but they were personnel managers. They passed the turkeys out at Christmas. They helped some folks with some wills and some pensions, but they didn't have the role to play that has morphed in for HR folks today, where the HR people should be sitting at the boardroom tables helping with the decision plans. But increasingly, that even has morphed further with this new industrial age. It seems to me, as we have moved from manufacturing into a service economy, about 80% of what Canada does, and with this Internet of Everything, how much more do we as individuals, that individual, we talked in fact in the strategy perspective of each individual can make a difference in your organization. Then the challenge is, how do we measure that individual's contribution to our bottom line? Well, the same thing is here. That individual now, with the Internet of Everything and the social media and coming into play, we need individuals that have different skills than they had in the industrial age. They need to analyze people quickly as psychological competencies. We need those sort of attributes that weren't so important before. But today, that ability to read and be sensitive to and motivate people is becoming increasingly important. And so we need to spend more time thinking about how we do that as one of the key thoughts that came out. Another key thought that I've said for some time, in fact, I designed the course you're going to take, the last residency, when you come in Res 2, it was a great thing. It's sort of a case analysis. Bring a client in, shares the problems they have, and the whole session is nothing but you listening to some experts and designing and coming up as consultants some solutions for them as can take away. But one of the people that I had in at that point was a very knowledgeable individual from another institution who talked about analytics, Google Analytics, and how important it is that all too often in MBA programs and graduate programs we push away from the quant side of the house. And I'm telling you that increasingly in this new industrial age, this new internet age, the importance of you picking up on the quants, whether it be marketing or financial ratios or whether it be statistics, the importance to start bringing some of that hard skills back into every discipline. So I'd encourage you to look at the Google Analytics and come to understand that. I think that's important. The other little thing I picked up on this week, and I think it's just coming through the fog, but the margins in the drug industry, in those pharmaceutical stores on the corner, Shoppers Drug Mart, and the corner little drugstores, etc., the margin on drugs, over-the-counter drugs, and the prescription drugs is fat. The supply chain is fat. And Google's identified this. Not Google, Amazon has identified this. And I think what we're going to see is starting to happen, that Amazon, again, taking over the world, is going to make a big play, as they did in the food industry. They're out in front right now, and Walmart's trying to catch up. I think we'll see a similar game plan come into the pharmaceutical side of the house, and every corner little drugstore is going to be under threat by Amazon doing the same model they're doing for food, is put your drug prescriptions in, they fill them and express them to you. faster than your corner store at prices substantially lower. They're going to wring the pennies out of the value chain, and that's going to cause a lot of disruption in the pharmacy business. Well, let's pick up from there, folks, if we can. That takes care of the administration for week 2 to some extent. What's in the news this week? Let's go through it quickly if we can. First, we have the Prime Minister who has apologized to the Chilcotin band based on an incident that took place back in 1864. That's 3 years before Canada's Confederation, when this was purely Britain's land. And we had a white road building crew that entered Chilcotin territory without permission in 1864. It ended up in a deadly battle where a number of workers on the road were killed, and five chiefs of the Chilcotin Nation were invited down to talk about this with the government representatives. And when they got there, they were arrested, and 5 were hung, and the 6th went through a lengthy trial, and then finally was hung. And so an apology. And so on its face, it's an interesting story, but I think out of that comes from, for strategists and impacting on how we do business, particularly in the oil industry, is we still have this embedded First Nations, Canada's founding nations. We haven't really solved the land claims yet, and we need to get at that, because uncertainty makes it difficult, as we see in the pipeline disputes almost on a regular basis, and roads are closed on a regular basis. And we need to turn our minds to this. We spend about $10 billion a year for the First Nations. There's something like 300,000, I believe I stand to be corrected, 300,000 actually on the reservation, up to 1 million in total living within the communities and urban centers, et cetera, and each and every year we go through $10 billion, and that's a lot of money, and you only have to drive through, as I drive through, say, the Band and Esquimalt, the finest land in all of Canada, on the water, beautiful land, but you can almost see the clear demarcation when you hit the Band territories till you find back into the waterfront homes and one thing or another that are there, and it obviously can't be filtering down to the grass levels, to the actual band members. Somewhere it disappears in bureaucrats and plastic shoes and chiefs, etc., down, that we may question. In fact, I often wonder if we truly have 1 million or 300,000 actually on the reservation, and we took this $10 billion, each one could be a millionaire. Put it in trust and have them sign off a quitclaim deed and get on with their lives and clean up this sort of issue. It's not as simple as that, but you get a sense what I'm saying is that I don't think we're being cost effective on going through $10 billion each year for what the outcome, and I see First Nations people struggling in less than comparable accommodations and quarters to what you and I have. So let's talk about that. Kinder Morgan is a good example. We have the Kinder Morgan pipeline, which this again talks about, particularly in BC, trying to get through there. And again, the First Nations, among others, are opposing that coming through. And you almost wonder, is it the infrastructure expenditures on the Trans-Canada Pipeline and the Kinder Morgan Pipeline? How long does the lifespan have to be to recapture those capital costs? And with the advent, as we're learning in this class, with the Internet of Everything, it seems to me that with the transformational shift from fossil fuels to alternative energy, I mean, I read the other day that there's enough energy arrives on the surface of the Earth in 2 minutes to satisfy all the electrical energy needs, all the energy needs in total for the whole world for a year. We just have to harness that free energy, and we're moving in that direction. There's a number of innovative things that we keep on talking about in this class with this transformational shift. And so it's a concern. So why don't we talk a bit about those sort of issues this week and see where it goes. The cholera case was first in the province, says our top medical doctor. It was herring eggs in the Up Island beds. A number of people got sick, not a lot, a few got sick from cholera, but it's an outbreak. But it led me to think for a few minutes about Canada's north. We have a very severe cases of tuberculosis up in Canada's north. We have the muskeg up there that is defrosting because of the climate change that's taking place. And as a result of that, both there and in Russia, particularly in Russia, an outbreak, there are interesting viruses that have been captured for tens of thousands of years in the frozen ice that are now being released into the communities, and it gives rise to the question of these new viruses coming in and pandemics. We could look a little bit about that. We could talk about the immigration in Canada in the sense that those who just walk across the border in Manitoba have not had TB checks, have not had measles checks or inoculations, etc. And we really have not kept our inoculations up, because in the past we've been kind of free of some of these. And it leads us to think about pandemic plans. Clearly the hospitals will not be able to handle a real pandemic, as we saw with the Asian flu outbreak in Toronto. And right now we have our people sleeping in corridors down the emergency departments in the Victoria hospitals. They just couldn't accommodate any more people. So maybe as strategists, we need to craft a strategy for our families, for our organizations, as well as for our communities on what happens if we have a pandemic. Why don't we talk a bit about those sort of issues this week? Delayed at the borders. Peace Arch undergoing construction is just a choke point right now. The court rejects the son's appeal over dying Nanaimo mom's pain meds and backs the doctor in the case. And here's an 80-year-old double amputee lady spent her last few months in great pain, crying out, intolerable the way they describe it, needed some morphine, but she had signed a health representative agreement in favor of her son and expressed to her son she really didn't want to be over-medicated. But the reality was when it actually hit with her legs and things and going back and forth daily to have the bandages changed, she was in great heavy-duty pain and they needed meds. And so Dr. Robin Love, recognized as a palliative care doctor, notwithstanding the health representative agreement, had courage and stood up and spoke for the lady and gave her the morphine at that point to ease off some of her pain for the next month or two. And of course the son felt and was torn with his mom's wishes, and the paper that she had signed was being transgressed. And so we have this conflict between those two playouts. And so we can look a little bit at the health representative agreements. We could look at the end of life for all of us. It's the money is spent, and we're under we don't need death panels and things, but certainly the last few months, the last year or two of old farts like me, that's when we chew up a lot of the money in the medical system. And to what extent do we need to revisit or talk about these sort of issues? And so I think that's open, this right to die legislation. We could talk about that because it does impact our healthcare costs, it impacts our insurance policies, etc. Alberta gets a victory in the pipeline for the Trans-Canada pipeline. The Federal Court of Canada ordered BC also to pay the legal costs for the Kinder Morgan to get on with it. But there's still some other impediments to play out through the court. And Notley says it's in the national interest. And we talked about Notley last week and the need to have royalties coming in for where she is. In the markets, it was interesting. The Canadian dollar is continuing to drop. We're down to about 77.6 cents. Again, I'm recording this on Wednesday. You'll see it on next Tuesday, so it's almost a week late at this point. But never, it's down to 77 cents. It was just 4 months ago I saw it 81 cents. So we've dropped 4 cents. That's a lot on margins for companies' bottom lines, making contracts 4 months ago to find they've lost 4 cents in every dollar just on the exchange rate. And my readings tell me that we may continue to drop down to a low of 73, that the economy in Canada looks a little bit different than American economy, and as a result, we may be stumbling a little bit. So let's watch for that. In Russia, organs, transplants are issues. They have this presumed consent, and other countries do as well. They have it in Austria, Spain, Sweden, and we have this real problem in across the globe, but certainly in Canada for kidneys and cornea transplants and heart transplants and lung transplants, and not enough parts to go around. And so the question becomes, should we have this presumed consent? And in Russia they have it, and sometimes they don't even wait for the person necessarily to be dead. This particular story talks of someone who was on life support, and they simply closed out the life support and harvested the organs against the parents' wishes, and that turned into a thing that went kind of sour. But there are questions in there. I have a daughter who's a diabetic, and also diabetic, also one of the kidneys, and has 2 transplants and failed. And so kidneys and kidney transplants are very near and dear to my heart. So I watch with interest 3D printing and the idea of innovation that's taking place in that field, and fingers are crossed eternally. But certainly the ethical question, is this sort of appropriate to harvest these sort of parts? Is it we can go fly to India? I mean, I've been tempted to take my daughter and take her to India. The hospitals are as good as or better than Canadian hospitals, and make it a tourist trip, go down and for a $10,000 bill, get a new transplant. But the problem is that the gatekeepers back here, the nephrologists, etc., will not handle those cases and take a chance on it, notwithstanding the quality of care that I believe you get in some Indian hospitals. And so there's some ethical issues. Anyway, I was going to talk a bit about the culture that, again, we could all maybe consider making better donations to these organs and transplants once you're dead, rather than burn them up in some sort of fire or bury underground. It seems to me there might be some benefit into being a little more proactive and making donations to this sort of cause. But let's have that discussion. Certainly, some cultures are reluctant to make those donations. Certainly, in the Asian culture, they don't seem to do it with the same regularity that, say, the Anglo-Saxons do. But anyway, just an observation. Canada loses out on oral insulin coup. Keep in mind, it was Banting and Best that found insulin. Connaught Labs in Ontario University. Just after the turn of the last century, I forget the year, I'm going to say somewhere around 1920, give or take a bit. We came out with insulin first time in Canada that did a lot of good for type 1 diabetes globally, and that's my other daughter who has type 1 diabetes. She's now 50, but she got it when she was 18 months old. And so, again, near and dear to my heart, the Serve on Committee is looking at that, but here Canada had the chance that there was a new company called Eastgate Biotech Corporation, using nanotechnology, has developed an oral insulin pill to treat type 2, which is not the juvenile diabetes, but the other one. Saves on needle injections. Just take this mouthwash, swish it around with a pill, and you've got your injection for the day. But they needed $10 million to take it through the last stages to get the proper government approvals for it. And they tried everything. They went and tried. Governments wouldn't do it. They tried venture plans, wouldn't do it. They just couldn't raise the $10 million to take it down the home stretch. So they got back and went to the Philippines. And the Philippine government jumped on it, and now they've been successful in bringing it out and getting ready to, not too far from now, roll it out through Asia first and soon be selling it here in Canada. But it just goes to, it was Michael Porter, the determinants on why nations are competitive. And there's 4 determinants. One of those is called factor endowments. I think I mentioned it on somebody's post. And there's the basic factor endowments. So that's the trees, the land, the water, the gold, 25% fresh water, and rare earths that we have as a nation. We're born with those things. And that helps us be competitive. But it also drives us, we have advanced factor endowments, and that's the money we invest in ourselves, in education, in intermodal transportation, in internet, broadband, those sort of things. And it's troubling that R&D, the leader right now is South Korea. They spend 4.4% of their GNP on research and development to drive forward and become competitive as a little nation. And Canada spends 1.69, less than 2%, 1.69, and the OECD country average is 2.4. So we spend less than most countries on research and development in Canada to drive these sort of projects like the oral insulin and stay out in front. And if we don't spend money building those advanced factor endowments, and other countries do, we're going to keep on sliding in our position in the OECD group of nations and our GNPs, etc. So we can do better and should. An interesting little story. What's next in my paper? Banking your children, financial literacy, and that's important for all of us, whether but to talk here about a vice president and his daughter and teaching her the value of money and savings and those sort of accounts. But financial literacy is something you should take a few minutes with your children and teach them on that. I did a little breakdown here. The rule of 72, you probably know it, but basically it takes the interest rate that you can achieve, divide it into 72, and it tells you how many years it takes to double your money. And so 10% is a little high, but say on a mutual fund, that's a little high, but just for rounding numbers, maybe 8% might be more realistic. But say 10% into 72 means roughly every 7 years your money would double. And based on that, I said if I gave my youngster at the age of 10 $2,000 and doubled it out to age 65, that $2,000, nothing more ever saved, just stick in the bank and leave it. At 65 in retirement, she'd have $500,000 just on the power of compound interest. And so it's things like that we need to talk to our kids about rather than go to the ski trip to Whistler this month and spend $1,000, put it into a locked away compound interest mutual fund and forget about it. Then you know they're taken care of when they hit old age. So that was interesting. Majority of Canadians in the survey plan to make Facebook changes. It's 73% of Canadians have been troubled by Facebook's actions and said they may make some changes. 27% said it'll be business as usual. Certainly we need regulations. It's a monopoly. We've talked a bit about that, and I'm going to talk a bit more about it as we go on. Mars, just a side, billions of years ago, I just caught my eye. But apparently Mars had as much water, looked very much like Earth, blue and little blue marble up there, had an atmosphere, but 3.7 billion a year, and things happened, maybe volcanoes or something, that destroyed the planet. And part of that, they say that the axis of Mars shifted. And interesting enough, scientists are telling us that the axis of the Earth's orbit is normally like a magnetic declination of 23.5% or something. That's shifting, and it shifts to a certain tipping point, and then poles reverse. And not necessarily in our lifetime, but over the years and years and years and years, it's something that we should just be cognizant of. But if you want something fun, you have a few minutes, just Google the word space junk. And you'll see out there that since the first orbits by the Russians back about 1957, we've been just taking our garbage, throwing out the window, and it travels at 18,500 miles an hour. And then like billiard balls, keeps banging in and vulcanizing and breaking because it's frozen hard. And now we have this whole ring of garbage up there, rare earths and metals and spaceships and garbage bags, that it's becoming a hazard just to get off the planet without banging into some of these things. There's been cases of windshield screens chipped, etc. Cod stocks show steep decline off the East Coast, all part of the global warming, climate change, in my mind, climate change. But I'm not sure what we can do about it. I don't think it's necessarily man-made. Now we can have that, have the myths have that dispute and argue both side positions, but certainly we can contribute. But I mean, just cattle alone, methane from cattle is far more significant in the pollution of the air. It just may be like Mars, that there's just a natural course of things, of the ebb and flow of ice ages and things, that we're just in one of those. But no wrong or right answers, but might be worth a discussion for our strategies and things going on around us and the opportunities that it presents. Certainly they said a lot of the waterfront properties are going to disappear over the next 20 years, and as the tide rises a little bit. Trudeau is calling for a women's business council in Canada. America has put one in under Ivanka Trump. Trump is leading the charge down there for female executives to have their own business council. Canada thinks it should have the same thing, so maybe this week we could talk a little bit. I mean, Trudeau, to his credit, has had 50% of his cabinet are females. We talked last week about lieutenant governors, 2 in a row now have been females for BC. We can talk about glass cliffs. We can talk about glass ceilings. A good club, good consulting work, about $50,000 a few years back, was the BC Women's Entrepreneur Society, a fabulous organization for women business entrepreneurs that want to have a network of mentors to help each other, and education, and share thoughts. And I'd encourage you to have a look at the Women's Council, certainly one in BC. Now, Canada's customs, something here. Oh, yeah, we're talking about opening up some customs facilities in the States. These border crossings and that are getting so choked, but yet we have snowbirds that fly from our country straight down to a landing place in Florida or in Arizona, and they're saying, wouldn't it be nice if we could actually have the customs facility there and take some of the strain off up here and go through customs when you arrive in America? An interesting point. I'd like that. The province is asking Ottawa to help fight money laundering here in BC, particularly the BC Lottery Association Corporation, is saying that anybody spending $10,000 or more in a 24-hour period has to be reported and fill out forms where the money comes from for this idea. They also want us to track the purchase of all luxury cars in the Greater Vancouver area, because they suspect that's been bought with laundered money. And so that leads me to believe that certainly there's no question some of that appears, but if you give that up at some point, you're giving up your own civil liberties to have that sort of government involvement. And digital currency in the EU, look over there what's happening, and see what happens in Cyprus and Greece when the country needs money. The money in the bank doesn't belong to you, by the way. If the bank wants to take the money, they have the right to take it. I think that was floated here in Canada by our government about 2 or 3 years ago, that be tracked and traces, but if there was some sort of national emergency for funds, they could encroach upon our funds in our bank account and take them. Now, I think they've backed off a little bit in Canada, but many nations have that. Let's talk about that a little bit this week. It'll be fun. Also, what bothers me too is this idea of man is born free, yet everywhere he's in chains. And it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau who said that a number of years ago. And we put these chains, these fetters on each other, and it's getting tighter and tighter, harder to move and swim with these lengths of chains that keep on attaching to us. And so the Americans had the Patriot Act, and we had the Anti-Terrorism Act in Canada to offset and match theirs. But there's increasing pressure, and has been over the years, by Americans to encroach upon Canada's sovereignty to make sure our banks and our trust companies, when they fill out new forms for new companies and new accounts, they have to meet the American standards. And that's okay for large banks. They've got the dollars in deep pockets to do it. But for small trust companies, it's an onerous task. And so we have to look for a little minute as our sovereignty eats away and we get closer, interdependent with our neighbor to the south. There comes a point, a tipping point. There's no way to get back. Whether you like it or not, we'll become the fifth state or 5 states or something up here for this merger. And so maybe that's a topic for some conversation sometime, is that we're sleepwalking into this economic, this political, this social, economic interdependence with the states. And I'm not sure we can break free because our military is sort of integrated through along the border for North American Defense, NORAD. We have drug enforcement agencies in Halifax and Vancouver that belong to the Americans, helping us patrol. We had the Olympics in Vancouver about 2 years ago. We had to have in the American Air Force to fly over and surveillance to make sure it was safe. I appreciate the need for this fortress North America and the sports, but with it comes a cost, and it certainly comes at a cost at a certain point. That fresh water we have sitting in the middle of our country, and our other resources are quickly tapped and diverted south, and we just need to have that business case, a chance to sit for a few minutes and truly decide this wonderful factor endowment country we have. Should we just look first as who our partners should be? We have a number of neighbors. We have the Russians are our neighbors. We have the Commonwealth connection through Britain. We have the Chinese that if you look out to 2050, their economy would be 3 times the size of the American economy. There'd be no question as to who is barring something untoward happening or between now and 2050, their economy 3 times the GNP, about $60 trillion by today's standards compared to $18 trillion. They'll have that by 2050. And so very much it's something we should look at is what's in the best interest of Canada and Canadians looking out in front. We haven't done that. We're just slowly, incrementally sleepwalking, click, 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 going towards political union with America. And we've had a number of agreements that are taking that. We're at step 3 right now out of the 5 steps towards that. So it's worth a discussion sometime because, again, it impacts our strategy and what we're going to do. No wrong or right answers, but certainly things we need to talk about. Remington seeking bankruptcy protection. Our grain rail backlog, CNN and CPR, they move all their grain from the prairies, and it comes with the harvest season, but we never seem to have enough grain tankers to move it to the coasts. And the same thing's coming up this year. We seem to be short, and so it's a concern. This stuff goes bad after a while sitting in silos. And so, again, it speaks to that factor endowments I'm talking about, that to be productive and be competitive, we've got to put the infrastructure in place. And CNN, it appears that we don't have what it needs to make it happen. And as a sidebar for that, I had an interesting chance to meet David McLean, about my age, wonderful fellow. And he's come up, had some lucky breaks. He was Kretchen's driver when he got out of law school, and he landed on some good things. So starting from scratch on the wrong side of the tracks, he became the chair of CNN for 20 years. And a number of other things. He's built a family business from zero to a multi-million-dollar business that owns airplanes and the film industry in Vancouver and real estate, etc. So quite a wide range of things. And he's accomplished it all. And he talks about succession planning in small businesses and how corporate governance for small businesses and the importance of education for succession planning. He took his whole family to Harvard for courses to train them to take over the family company. If you have time and interest and want to look at it, look at McLean's video up there. Quite interesting. Good. What's else? Twitter. Oh yeah. Twitter bans cryptocurrency ads. And there's a real move afoot for Bitcoin in particular, because it's governments don't control Bitcoin. There's a whole avalanche of pressure being brought to bear to collapse, close, throw mud at it. But at the same time, if you do a little search, you'll find out that Britain and America are opening up their own cryptocurrencies to compete with Bitcoin, because now they see the way for digital currency and Bitcoins, but they don't want this private one that you can move funds around, pay for around the world, and they don't get a piece of it, and they can't trace who's got the money, so it's an issue. But certainly the model basically in Britain and America is that they'll pick the appropriate banks. Like in Canada, they may say, okay, the 6 big banks are appropriate. You go down there, you put your money into your bank, you get your certificate, buy your gold, and ship it into the government. And then once the bank satisfies that we have your cash, et cetera, then the cryptocurrency will be issued by the state, and you'll get your zeros and ones on the computer that you can transfer money around. And that saves money, that you don't have to exchange your dollar to do business deals in Russia through the American currency first and then into the Russian currency. And so there's an argument for it. But we could talk a bit about Bitcoins and things today. CN's, another rail story. CN's national former chief executive got $12.3 million as his golden handshake when he departed in 2017. $12.3 million. And just reflect for a minute on the differences between the frontline clerks and what their hourly rate and what handshake they get when they leave, compared to somebody who's only been in there. My recollection, he's only been there about 2 years. He gets $12.3 million. So we could look at the disparity, this gap between the rich and the poor, and in work. It's not like that in Europe. In Europe, the frontline worker is maybe 10 times more for the executive. Here it's like 100 times more. And so we're really out of alignment. And that became very clear when we watched the mergers and acquisitions of Mercedes-Benz, the Daimler-Chrysler merger that took place. There was such a wide range in cultural clash in many areas, but one was certainly in the pay and allowances for the frontline worker on the Mercedes line compared to the American worker, and then what the American CEO got and what the CEO of Mercedes-Benz got. It was completely out of alignment. They were just so far apart on what the ratios were. Landlord bids has dropped to hike rent. Toronto, there was a rent strike went on. They took it to the Residence Tenancy Act, and again the government prevailed to keep the pressure on landlords. But it begs the question again, this idea of Rousseau's of being born free and we're in chains, that it seems to me that this is government interference. If government wants housing for budget price housing, it shouldn't be on the backs of the landlords that are into the business. It seems government should be building those houses and be responsible for them. It's this Plato, and the way you're going to answer this, it seems to me, is Plato and Aristotle. And I think I've talked briefly about this already, but you have we all have biases, and your bias would be one of these two to some extent or another. You have the Plato bias, where you have the Marx, the collectivism, the socialist, the one for all for one. Nothing wrong with that. That's just the view that NDP are sort of more on this side. And on the other side, you have, not John Stuart Mills, he was a libertarian, but Adam Smith, Dave Ricardo, John Stuart Mills, I'm not sure, he's a libertarian. Adam Smith, Dave Ricardo, John Wayne, etc. These fights, low taxes, get out of the way, don't need government, just bare minimum, just give me my national security, protect my interests, and get out of the way. And between those two pendulums would depend how you answer this question. What's the role of the state in providing housing? If you're more of the NDP, Plato philosophy, collectivism, you'll say, yes, we should rob from the rich, give from the poor, we should redistribute income. What Obama did down south, President Obama did down south, is this progressive idea of spreading the socialist state. And on the other side, you have more of the, not to say Trump, but farther right than that, the idea that no, everybody takes care of themselves. We'll just put the bare minimum in. We recognize some people need help. Those people should get help, but not to the extent it is now, not to 100,000 people on food stamps. We do it. And so you have that situation playing out. Certainly in BC, we saw this vacancy rate on people's homes, their cottages and things. If you left it vacant or didn't rent it for 6 months or so, you're going to be taxed at an exorbitant rate each year, enough to drive you out of it, to force you to sell it. And in fact, it leads me to ask the question that, what would you call a country that takes 50% of your money in taxes of all natures, sanctions you to the extent we are sanctioned for taxes and landlord tenancies and all these sort of things. What would you call that country? And I think many of you might use the word tyranny. I could be wrong. We can have that conversation. My bias, I guess you suspect by now, is right-wing Attila the Hun. I'm not going to talk much more about this. We have the porn star things going with the CNN, 2 60-minute things, hard-hitting news. We have Trump down below playing musical chairs with the cabinet, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, as Collins said, that get the wrong bums off the bus, the right bums on the bus, and the right bums in the right seats. And I think he's doing that. And in business, you've got to do that. You can't just sit and because somebody's a government worker, they're there for life. It's like a baseball team, a football team. You put your best team forward as the situation dictates, and it's a fluid game. Political force, we had this recruiting drive in the States of all the young people who March for Our Lives, funded by tens of millions of dollars for gun control. Tom Steyer, billionaire hedge fund, put $31 million in. Michael Bloomberg organized something called Gun Safety. Billionaire put money in. Another organization put $1 million in to help the student organizers get it. So it wasn't just a spontaneous thing. It was well organized, a recruiting drive for November election, and they're pushing hard to do that. Pot legalized, shouldn't clog borders. Same thing, that here we have the idea that in certain states in America it's legal to have pot. In Canada it's legal in certain places to have pot. And when you take your pot across the border, it can cause great problems because they haven't got the reciprocal agreement yet to move back and forth. But it led me to think for a few minutes about interprovincial trade barriers in our country, that we spend about $20 billion more than we have to spend a year for this sort of foolishness, that going from Alberta to BC, if the trucks don't have the lights in the appropriate places as required by the province they're going into, then they have to offload and use another truck. And there's all sorts of those little administrative things that aren't aligned, and as a result of that, we lose great money in Canada in our efficiencies. And so we need to, in fact, there's more barriers to trade sometimes, it seems, moving liquor and beer from province to province than there is in taking goods and services back and forth to the States under NAFTA. Housing mainstay, this is what I just talked about. Ottawa's got a $40 billion plan to put in place housing. It says a right to housing is what they've argued, and they're going to put over 10 years $40 billion to build the housing. And I guess that kind of makes sense, particularly if you're on the Plato side of the world. But it's interesting, they won't start it till after the next election in any meaningful way. But it also speaks to the need of what we're talking about in this class, is that if you accept or start to accept, based on a little more time together, that there's going to be this growing gap as we transform and transition this disruptive new industrial age to brand new jobs with job descriptions yet to be written, and truck drivers by the hundreds of thousands, and that sort of laid off the shift. And I sent out to you this transformational shift of the Times Square about 20 years apart of horse and buggy to cars, and imagine the infrastructure behind all that, what had to change on job descriptions and things. It's happening quicker now as we go through this. And so this gap between rich and poor, we're going to have to find some accommodation for the folks that don't make the cut, can't retool. The 45-year-old worker that doesn't go back to school and says, I'll just wrap it up here. They need bread and circuses. They need a guaranteed annual income. We'll talk about, they need something to do it. And so housing is one thing we're going to have to consider. Or we have social unrest. But what do you think? Do you agree, disagree? Good talk, again, for strategy. Facebook's under investigation, continues. U.S. regulators, states, attorneys generals are looking at them. The 37 states and territories are now on to Facebook doing something. It looks like Facebook also, it came out that they have collected over the years your contact names, your telephone numbers, your call links, and information about the text messages that you sent. They kept them all. And so they have it in their data mining base that they have. It's just humongous what they control. European officials are on. German justice ministers are after them. UK Parliament has summoned Zuckerberg to come talk. Apparently he's not going to go over there and do that. Cook County, Illinois are suing Facebook. And it leads to these filter bubbles in elections. I did a little look at that. And elections coming up in November, certainly Canada has them too. And I found that apparently this company has done over the past number of years over 100 election campaigns. They've given data. This is just the Cambridge one was just one, but if you go back, they've done this 100 times prior to that in 30 countries. I went down the list of countries. Canada's not one, but main countries are in there that they've played a role in data mining and giving away your information and tailoring your reports. They also shift on the Google and on the Facebook pages what they want you to read and what they don't want you to read, which is generally the right-wing Attila the Hun stuff. They'll hide it way down at the bottom that you'll never see. And so, do you want that? I mean, that's one of your basic rights. It's free speech. It comes from God, not made by man, and it seems to me that man shouldn't have the right to impede upon that or take it away from you or allow you to have it. But here we have the situation that your free speech, your freedom of thought, is being influenced by the small oligarch of, I call them the Four Horsemen, impacting. Russian spies, we booted a dozen out. I guess we got the story on that by now, looking at it. But I want to just talk for a minute is what it appears to me is going on is Brzezinski wrote a wonderful book called The Grand Chessboard. It's still very effective. He took every nation in the world and, like a chess player, he said, how would I play Canada? How would I play the Philippines? All in the best interest of America. And what's happened, it seems to me, is that there's been a vacuum left over the last couple of presidencies have pulled back to some extent, less involvement to some extent, and more of a shift to this globalization to Brussels, to speaking with the United Nations voices. And as they've done that, that sign of weakness has allowed Russia and China and others to come in and flood the vacancy left. And so we see that China is coming down into the South China Sea and East China Sea and is doing it with impunity until the other day that Carl Vinson went in and went into Vietnam, and all of a sudden they're still exercising some control over those areas of the Middle Kingdom and said these are our territories and have been for a couple of millennium. We talk in terms of the Belt and Road thing that runs across to Spain from China. We talk of going down into African nations and the infrastructure going in, intermodal transportation, and the money being lent to put that in place, and the Chinese influence, soft influence, coming to put the security and things in place all the way over there and all the way back to secure supply chains for the economy to drive this 3 times the GMP engine that China's heading for. All that is unfolding. We see this influence spreading through the Middle East. Russia has been able now to come down into Syria and has got its ports and its bases and influence now in the Mediterranean. They're quite content with that. They're happy with that. We have China and Iran and Russia. We have the Shanghai Cooperative Association. It's all sorts of fleshing out at this point, coming into it. I guess what I'm saying is that I see the stiffening taking place in the other side of the table and this grand chessboard are starting to move their things into position, and America's been slow getting off the start. America is now at the start point. It's now starting to do things. It's starting to insist on NATO nations driving up their contribution towards NATO by 2%. America gives far more than that. Canada gives about 0.8 of 1% towards that. We offset that and say, well, we give more on the humanity side, and to some extent that's true. But nevertheless, on military, there's a commitment made, unofficial, not locked in, but a sort of a memorandum of agreement that we would all do 2%. And to their credit, these nations are starting to build up. America put $1.3 trillion through a budget the other day. 700 some odd billion of that was for military. It's going to need a couple of years to reboot, revise, refresh, because America has been drained down. But you can see it's stiffening starting to happen, and it's something we should be watching for with the increasing hacks, the 6 domains of war and economic war and trade wars that are taking place. The temperature level is rising, the stiffening is taking place. Watch for the move of the chessboard. It's happening. Certainly, America going to have the full self-sustain on energies and be able to ship some stuff off to Europe, which is doing, is cutting into the cake of Russia. Russia's driven primarily by commodities and oil and gas, and is now feeling the pain. And so it really has to move now while it's strong, because it's growing weaker as the price of oil is around $66 a barrel. And America is quite deliberately doing its best to hold it down there, because it's putting the squeeze on Venezuela and countries like Russia. Well, I don't want to take much more of your time. I want to be respectful. I did have other things to say, but maybe just one out of Bloomberg. Yeah, just the point that Japan is one of the first off the mark on all its convenience stores taking over by drones and by artificial intelligence and by computers, and people being laid off. It's happening over there. So that's it. Things on the close today. I want to talk about Monday. We're off. Exam is 2 parts. The second part of the exam will be a case. I'll give you the case itself on Monday of the last week of our course. So you'll be able to look at the case, read it, discuss it with your colleagues, figure out for yourself what the questions might be, practice writing, and that's 50% of the exam. The other 50% of the exam is things you don't really study for. You just do what you're doing. I do what I call deep learning as opposed to surface learning. It's not about memorizing 10 points on page 69, but rather just by internalization, by doing, as you'll do through the practice cases we'll be doing coming up, the Royal Roads Goes Global and those other ones, Robin Hood case. You'll pick up practice schools and learn things going along. And on the exam, I simply may say, no man is an island, discuss in the context of strategy. Well, that's the economic web. That's the pulling one spider web, it distorts the other. It's the economic interdependence. All answers will be different, but it's that sort of thinking. We'll talk more about it anyway as the course unfolds. Once you relax, have some fun. Once you pick up your topics, still a couple teams haven't yet identified what topic they want. Make sure you got a little note back from me saying you've got it. Well, that's it for today, folks. Sorry it took a little longer, but I enjoy these and I hope you're enjoying the course too. Have a good weekend. Bye for now.